now we begin kind of the next phase of this, where we are talking kind of in the philosophical view, the framework, the epistemological views of the kind of how to evaluate the kind of knowledge that we just talked about. So we just talked about a series of facts that are recognized in academia to be by, let's say, a series of scholars in that field facts that are recognized in academia, reasonably assertable by, say, a series of scholars in that. But as human beings, if we're going to make life decisions based on some fact pattern or some information that comes to us, how do we actually go about doing that? How do we decide what's true? And maybe equally importantly, how do we decide what things are true, but maybe they could be false, so I'm not going to base my life on it, versus like, no, this is life-changing stuff. I need to do something about this. So examples of life-changing stuff that I need to do something about might be you have cancer and someone claims that they've got a cure for cancer, whether it's your doctor or whether it's some guy on the street with a bottle of snake oil. At some point, if you know you're dying of cancer, you're motivated to look into those things. But how do you know which treatment sets you look at? In terms of philosophy, the thoughtful person eventually, by the time they grow up at some point, asks the question, why do I believe the things that I believe? Was I just taught these things and therefore I think they're true? Does the culture tell me they're true and I'm just kind of going along with the flow? How do we know what's true and what's not? And furthermore, just because the culture told me something doesn't mean it's true, but it also doesn't mean it's false. So how am I supposed to know that just because everybody else believes this, I believe this, but does that make it true or false? So in short, we talked over the last 4 weeks about having a standard that you're trying to reach in terms of, if the knowledge that I have hits this standard, then I think that it's true and something that I might act on. And then, of course, what your measurement device is to measure those facts or those beliefs or those truth claims, etc. And I think I said we were giving you the floor at the beginning last time. So if you want to take the floor, great, fire away.
Yeah, maybe a few things just to say about the last session.
Let's do a few things.
And one thing I noticed, and that I've noticed a lot in previous discussions of this issue,
yes,
is that you say that there's these 4 or 5 facts, and that's what the case is based on. But last week you gave a whole session with facts completely outside of those 5. So many additional facts are listed.
Right.
So you go outside the minimum facts.
Yes.
And that always seems to be the case.
So why do we think that's the case? Let's say that we say there are 5 minimal facts or something like that. Here's an argument based on these minimal facts. But other facts are given. Why do we do that? Or maybe I'll ask it in this way. So this will go outside the immediate thing we had. Sometimes you'll see, and we've done it in this class before, and we did it in that debate, where we said, like, here's a cosmological argument. And someone will put down, this one is the classic formation of it is like 2 premises, P1, P2, and a conclusion. But it's never, like, the discussion is almost never just those 3 things. The reason being, when you make some assertion, P1, or premise 1 or premise 2, because this was a deductive argument, 1 plus 1 equals 2 here, very clearly that usually isn't what's under debate. What's under debate is premise 1 true, or is premise 2 true? So what I think that we were, hopefully, what we were doing there was making further arguments for the minimal facts themselves. So if it's the case that...
Well, it goes beyond that because, for example, use of doubting Thomas touching Jesus, or the fact that he ate fish, and those kinds of details are additional evidences that don't prove the minimal facts, but do support them.
Yeah, I think those are evidence.
Not proving, there are more facts that people don't agree with happen. Most scholars don't think those things happen, but they get snuck in because I think there's a background. You already accept the Gospels as background,
Yep.
So you take all the details from those stories, and they're in your background when you're thinking about these minimal facts.
Yes.
But that's invalid if you want to stick to the minimal facts.
Fair enough. I think I can agree with that. So then basically the point would be, the point he's making, if I'll restate it and tell me if that's right, is it's not entirely fair. It's not entirely fair. It's not fair to claim that the minimal facts approach are these 4 plus 1 minimal facts, which I don't know why we don't call those 5 minimal facts. No, 4 plus 1 is 5. 5 minimal facts, and just the best explanation of those minimal facts is that Jesus rose from the dead. So I do think that people are trying to give additional evidence to support it. But then let's just back up and treat those 5 minimal facts and those alone. Given Jesus was crucified, empty tomb, disciples believed they had experiences of him having risen from the dead. Paul and James, who were opponents, were converted. People who claimed to have direct interaction, not legendary accretion type of stuff. Given those facts, do we believe, what is the best explanation of those facts? So I think that in what the best argument that the book makes is to say all of the alternate hypotheses. I think maybe I drew this last time, but I don't know if I did. But like here are all 5 of those facts. We'll just I guess we'll maybe break them out as a pie chart, say, and like here are 5 unequal facts here, and that the alternate hypotheses do not explain all 5 facts. So there are 5 agreed upon facts, and the alternate hypotheses fail in terms of either explanatory power or in some cases just in terms of evidence that attempt to contravene those. But of the facts, the ones that include just those facts, that the explanation that Jesus rose from the dead is the only one that encompasses all 5 facts, and that it is reasonably also a good explanation of those 5 facts. That is to say, if it's the case that you believe God can raise people from the dead, and let's say that you believe that with equal power to things that can happen from a normal laws of nature physics basis, then the best explanation would be that. I think, unless I'm wrong, so I may be exceeding my brief here, where you and I probably disagree is that you believe that either God does not exist at all, or that because you don't know whether God exists, to advance that as an equal hypothesis it would be unwise, would be irrational.
That's true, but at a more granular level, I think even the alternative hypotheses in many cases were debunked, as you might say, with information outside of the minimal facts and information that I wouldn't agree with necessarily. For example, against the idea of hallucinations,
yes,
you say that there were group appearances, but that's not part of the minimal facts.
The minimal facts include that he was seen by 500 people. That's part of it.
500? Well, I don't think that's one of the minimal facts, and if it is, it's not something that scholars hold in consensus. So I think that's completely false.
At least according to the book, the scholars agree that the Gospels state that he made appearances to the
Gospels don't state that.
The 10 and Acts states that the Gospels and Acts state that he appeared to a number of people at one time,
right? And
that number was over 500 according to Acts.
Well, the 500 number comes from Paul. I don't think Acts specifically says how many.
I'll double check. You may be right that Paul does. That's right. Paul summarizes it.
The only place in the Bible we get 500 people.
That's correct. That's correct.
And if that really happened, we would probably see it in the Gospels. It wouldn't be something that would be left out. That would be major evidence. People would be talking about that after it happened. So the fact that it doesn't exist anywhere else indicates to most scholars that it didn't happen. Certainly we can't assume that it happened. So I wouldn't consider that part of minimal facts.
Yeah, I don't think I agree with you that most scholars would agree that because it's not in the Gospels that means it didn't happen. That's just not a way historians typically operate.
Well, because it should be there. it's not just because it's not there, but because it should be there. It's the kind of fact that if it happened, it would be considered one of the best evidences for Jesus' resurrection. And surely Mark, Matthew, Luke, or John would have mentioned it. Even if you think that Acts mentions it rather than some other...
I'm sorry, you're right. Paul is the one who mentions it.
Then he would have been more specific about it if there was evidence about that. And even I think later church fathers don't really use that. I'm not totally sure about that.
Okay.
But it's not just because it's not there. It's because it's not there when it should be there.
Yeah, I would say not there when it should be there is a good criterion to use. I don't know that I agree that most scholars believe that it should be there in the Gospels, because as an example, just one that's probably kind of the obvious one, Luke's Gospel is paired with Acts, so you would expect, this one is up until a discrete time, and this one picks up at that time, and so volume 1, volume 2 kind of thing. So I agree with that, but I think we have. Go ahead. I'll let you jump in.
Doesn't it mention the 500? That's part of like a pre-Pauline, creedal statement, which would be the oral tradition.
Right. So yeah. So in terms of where scholars would, I don't think scholars, based on reasoning like that, scholars would tend to turn around and ask the question of, when did these data enter the psyche of the people who are writing it down? Is there evidence that it was within a couple of years of it, or is there evidence that this was accretion from 50 years later or something like that?
Right, but we don't have any solid. He doesn't tell us where he learned this or why he thinks this is true.
Well, he tells us a couple places where he doesn't say exactly, I learned exactly this, but he talks about what he received, and then the stuff that he talks about is presumably what he received. And he talks about from whom he received it and the timeline of that happening.
But even that's contradictory. In one place he says he received it only from God, from Christ himself in Revelations, and then in another place he says, no, I went and talked to him.
I think that's an uncharitable reading of what he's saying. What he is saying is his revelation, his apostleship, the authority of being an apostle for him, comes directly from Jesus. It does not come from the council or the 12 or the 11. It comes from Jesus. And what he says elsewhere, though, is that which I received, where he appears to be talking about the doctrinal beliefs, and in this case, the creed to which he's referring. That was what was told to him. The debate, I think the legitimate debate, in my limited opinion, is whether he received that immediately on his conversion, or whether post his 3-year hiatus in sabbatical, so to speak, in Arabia, did he come back, and when he visited Peter in Jerusalem after that, is that when he received it? So that's a reasonable debate, because the data are certainly incomplete in Acts about when that happened, and in his own letters.
Do you still have the minimal facts up there?
Yeah, I can. Where did I have that set? Was that Kindle? Is that where we had that? I think so. But go ahead while I look this up.
So yeah, I'll grant your reading on that issue. It's tertiary for me.
Okay.
But I don't think that most mainstream scholars accept the sightings of the 500. And I think we're not even sure that the apostles, based on Corinthians, or the disciples, saw Jesus, or their claimed sightings were all at once. All he says is that he appeared to them. But when he does mention the 500, he says that it happened all at once. It doesn't say that with the disciples. So it's possible that the disciples saw them individually, or at different times. And I think it's also not clear that all the disciples actually had sightings. We know very little about most of the disciples.
I think that's only if you don't accept the Gospels as historical literature.
Right,
the Gospels
we're accepting the 5 facts. If you're accepting the Gospels with all this background information,
but these facts come from, in many places, the Gospels.
Right, but if you want to make a case based on these 5 minimal facts, you can't smuggle in additional facts.
No,
so the only facts we have are the ones that we put up there.
So let's distinguish between facts and evidence for the facts. Okay, so I may say something like this: it's a fact that in our murder case that I'm always bringing up, that this guy's gun was found on site of where the murderer was. That fact, you don't just leave it there and say, well, why? How do I know that that's a fact? Well, one guy said that because he saw it. That's part of the evidence would say that. But more evidence would be the ATF ran the serial number against purchase records, right? So if I'm going to say that there's a minimal fact, and the minimal fact is this gun belonged to Steve, and then I turn around and further cite, here's these ATF records that show registration by Steve to this gun. That is a fact outside of the fact itself, but it's evidence that comes from history, or in this case, some forensic stuff. So
right,
of course you're going to use.
Don't accept these other facts that you're talking about. The only reason
why do you think scholars don't accept these other facts?
Most mainstream scholars do not accept that the Gospels are completely accurate word for word.
No, nobody says that has to be the case in order for that to be evidence.
So then to bring this additional evidence in, we have to talk about each individual piece.
I agree with that, but it does not have to be the case that the Gospels are truthful word for word in order for things that the Gospels attest to be
But the only thing that we've agreed upon, that everyone agrees on, are the 5 minimal facts. And I don't.
But the 5 minimal facts are not brute facts. The 5 minimal facts are agreed upon because of the historical evidence, much of which comes from the Gospel.
I think most people agree. Many scholars point to Paul.
So why do you think
Paul is the main source?
Let's do it one at a time. Why do you think that most scholars believe that the disciples had beliefs that they saw the risen Jesus? Why do you think they think that? The scholars.
Well, that's one thing I wanted to argue against. I think it is most scholars believe that, but I don't think all scholars believe that.
Nobody says all. Nobody's saying all. I'm saying
for
most.
Example, and I think it's incorrect to believe that. I don't think there's good evidence for it. I think they believe it because of tradition, and that's what they're predisposed to believe.
You think most historical scholars believe that Jesus, that the disciples claim to have seen the risen Jesus, that they believe that because of tradition?
Because of the Gospels, yes.
They believe it because of the Gospels.
Which are tradition.
That's not tradition. Tradition is very different from the Gospels.
They come from oral tradition.
No, in Christian theology, theological terms, Gospels are documentary evidence. Tradition are things that are developed subsequent to the initial historical material to which we all have access. So at least in terminologically, tradition means something different from this kind of evidence.
Scholars believe that the Gospels themselves are the product of oral tradition passed down by the earliest generations of Christians.
No, they do not. They believe that many of them, most of them, believe that the Gospels are aggregations of eyewitness accounts.
I don't think that's accurate.
That is 100% I don't mean to say it's not controversial, but that is absolutely the norm. That Matthew is supposed to have been...
Maybe conservative scholars, but most scholars do not believe that any of the Gospels were written by the people that they're named for, or they have no idea what the sources are, other than that they come from oral traditions, and that Matthew and Luke use Mark.
Yep.
And they don't even know if John knew the other Gospels or not because it's so different.
Right.
But who the Gospels are to be attributed to, no one knows.
I see. That is not a standard historical viewpoint. The majority of scholars, as an example, agree that Luke is the author of Luke. That's not controversial. The question is, who is Luke's primary source? If
you read common introductory textbooks to the New Testament that are used in universities nationwide, none of the authorship is secure. It's Luke included.
So I believe that we disagree about what the assessment is, but the only way to solve that disagreement would be to do a survey of people. Right. Okay. But at any case, it is not the case that even modern scholars, taken as a whole body, which, by the way, it shouldn't strike anybody as unusual to understand or believe that the majority of scholars that we're talking about here, many of them are Christians. In fact, most of them are Christians. But it is also not fair to say because they're Christians, they're therefore unreliable. That's like saying this person believes is an adherent of relativity theory. They're writing papers on relativity theory, therefore they're unreliable because they already believe in the stuff that they're talking about. It's not fair to say that.
I agree with that. Generally speaking, I think that there are a lot of Christian scholars that are objective, but I don't agree with that when it comes to this conservative scholars that teach at universities where you have to sign faith statements before you can even go there. And this is totally unscholarly.
I happen to object. I object to the process of you have to, before you come and learn anything, we want you to say that this is what you believe, right? I'm supposed to show up so I can learn. I agree with you there.
Going back to the original point of appearances before the 12, even if you threw out the Gospels and just take Paul, in Paul it says he appears to Peter first, and then to the 12. If it was not Paul at the same time, it would have been like the rest of the disciples, not Peter, and then the 12, because Peter's part of the 12.
Right.
That's true, but he doesn't give any. It's not necessarily inconsistent that he could have appeared to Peter and then later to the other disciples. And we also know it's wrong that he appeared to 12 because Judas was dead, right? So even that detail indicates to us that Paul isn't being exactly accurate. If he wanted to have been accurate, he would have said the 11. But he said the 12. Don't know why. It could just be shorthand, but it's inaccurate.
So but you'll remember the disciples replaced Judas immediately.
Not by that time. Right?
By what time?
By the time of the appearances, it occurred right afterwards.
I don't know that. I don't know that we know that.
We don't know that.
Yeah, we don't know that.
We don't have a timeline
I think
there that gives day, time, and date on when X, Y, or Z occurred. So therefore, it's kind of arguing from absence that, there weren't 12, and we don't know that. And maybe at a separate time, if he appears to the 12, it doesn't say he appeared to them all at once. It could have been that he appeared to Judas prior to Judas killing himself. So that could be a very accurate statement. We just don't know because it's not written. If we don't have the information to say either way, then we have to go with what's said.
Well, if he appeared to Judas at a different time, then that kind of proves my point that they didn't all have to be at the same time. But I think we didn't.
Well, he couldn't appear to Judas because Judas was dead before he rose.
When was Judas replaced? Okay, that's right.
Yeah, didn't Matthias replace Judas? Yeah. And I think we have some understanding of when that happened. I think it was after the sightings happened and after they started on the mission.
We have when Luke records it, but what we don't have is when that occurred in the time.
Okay.
But to your
accepted that it didn't happen.
To your point, I think that's probably true. I'm sorry. Yes. Okay. Yes, sir.
When we're saying Paul said this, Paul said that, what books are you referring to?
Corinthians.
Yeah, each one of them were slightly different depending on which factor you're talking about, but a lot of it. Yeah, sorry.
Corinthians. That's one.
So is Acts legitimate to talk about?
Yes, I think so.
Well, in Acts 1, the author says, after his suffering, he presented himself to them and gave many convincing proofs that he was alive. He appeared to them over a period of 40 days and spoke about the kingdom of God. On occasion, while he was eating them, he gave them this command: do not leave Jerusalem. I'm paraphrasing until the Holy Spirit comes. So,
Yeah.
they apparently believed well enough to stake their lives on it. They were fairly convinced enough.
Yeah, well, I would say that
There you go.
it's good that it's good. Well, again, going outside, you have to if you're going to find evidence for it.
Okay, I'll take that point. You have to go outside the 5 facts.
No,
if you want to.
hang on.
The
It's
deaths of the disciples is not needed to prove the other 5 facts. He just brought in the martyrdoms.
It absolutely is needed to prove the 5 facts because one of the most convincing proofs to me personally. So I mean, you can shake your head, but let me explain to you why I consider this to be evidence. So I take a Bayesian view of evidence, which says evidence is data, which make a hypothesis more likely to be true than it was absent those data. Okay. So that allows for all evidence, super weak evidence, where you're like, okay, technically that's evidence, but that's not enough to be convincing, all the way down to proof. So that Bayesian definition of evidence qualifies everything that could possibly be evidence because it's anything that makes it more probably true than it would have been absent those data or on the background information alone. Given that, if you ask yourself the question, why do we believe that the disciples believed that Jesus rose from the dead? So some of the evidence, so that's the fact is the disciples genuinely believe that they encountered the risen Christ. That's the fact that we're talking about, the claimed fact. The evidence for it, all of the evidence is outside of that fact. Every single bit of evidence, the oral tradition, the Gospels, Acts, anything coming from church fathers or secular sources, all that's technically outside the facts. But those are the evidence bases that is the basis by which historians believe that this fact is correct.
That's not true. That may be why you think that's correct. But
hold on.
A lot of scholars.
Let me ask you the question this way. Let's consider the fact the disciples.
Can I finish my point real quick?
Well, let me finish my point first, and then you may finish yours. Because we're not answering my question. My point is this. Here's the fact: the disciples believed that they encountered the risen Jesus.
Right.
Period.
Right. Many scholars believe that the disciples believed that they had appearances of the risen Jesus,
yes,
and do not believe that in the martyrdom stories.
Got it.
Or they
So hold
only
on.
believe in Peter.
Why do scholars believe that?
Believe what?
Believe that the disciples believe they encountered the risen Jesus.
Well, the point I wanted to make is that scholars don't all agree that all the disciples believe that. There's really
Got it. That's not my question. My question isn't why don't they believe something else. My question is very simple. Why do they believe that fact?
Because Christianity continued is a major fact. And it probably couldn't, if at least some of the disciples didn't believe it, to spread the religion. I'm
happy to say that there would be no historian worth his salt that would say, I believe that that's the case, because that's not what they say. They turn around, the historian will turn around and point to historical evidence. So my question to you is, to what historical evidence did they point? Do you think that it's only, that all of these scholars only believe that the disciples believe that?
So my point is that their belief isn't well-founded, because they're accepting later tradition from the early church fathers. They're accepting evidence from the Gospels that are not accepted by all scholars. So other scholars...
Do you think there's any evidence in the Gospels that are accepted by... No, again, you keep using the term all. Let me be very clear. 100% clear, so that we don't... There is no...
Used the word all a couple of times.
I have not. I've said most. There is no all. No all.
You just said it a second ago. But
when?
When you were just speaking, you just said also.
I said all. I said no historian would say blah 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 blah.
Okay. I mean, I don't want to argue that point. I'm not trying to say that all of them have to agree, but
we're saying a majority.
Even if there's one that disagrees, it depends on the reasoning at that point.
Yes, and I'm asking you, what is the basis for their reasoning?
What I'm pointing out is that not all scholars accept that the disciples were martyred.
Again,
not all.
Never said all. The majority of scholars believe that the disciples believed.
Okay, maybe the majority, but very important ones don't believe that. So, like, part of
again, that's not part of the argument. That's not part of the argument. The argument these guys are making, and this is the only one I'm defending at this point.
You're going outside of the 5 accepted facts.
No, I'm sticking only to the 5 accepted facts. I can go outside.
It's not one of the 5 accepted facts.
You
think it supports the 5 accepted facts, but it's not one of the 5 accepted facts.
Brother, the point I'm trying to get to you is the fact is only that the disciples believed that they encountered the risen Jesus.
But
okay. But hold on, let me finish, brother. That's the fact. Anything else, there's evidence for that fact. People don't believe that fact just out of zero.
They believe it for different reasons.
Historians believe it for different reasons. I'm asking you that given, if we posit that the majority of Christians, scriptural scholars, believe that fact, I'm asking you, on what evidence do they believe that fact?
I think you have different evidences.
And the book points those out. But part of the evidence is the evidence of the Gospels.
Some of them accept that, some of them don't. It's controversial.
Are you telling me that there are New Testament scholars that do not believe, other than fringe, like way fringe, there are New Testament scholars that believe that everything in the New Testament was fabricated?
No,
okay. Do you think that they think that there is good reason to believe that the disciples believe they encountered Christ based on the data in the Gospel?
Some of them, yes.
Okay. And
some of the disciples, we don't have particular evidences about all 12 of them. You don't even really know anything about most of the disciples.
Well, again, I think
we don't even know some of the,
from a comparative historical perspective, we know a lot about them compared to a lot of ancient sources. So again, when you say we don't know a lot about them,
most of what we know about most of the disciples comes from later tradition from the 2nd century.
I'll say fine. I don't understand how that answers the question I'm asking you.
Because it brings in a lot of doubt as to what happened to those disciples. We don't really know what happened with those disciples. We don't know. We get no details in Paul about the nature of the sightings, whether they were all together. I think what happened, or was more likely to have happened, is that Peter had a vision or some kind of experience that he interpreted as having seen Jesus and told the other disciples about it, and that primed them. Maybe they had some of their own experiences. Maybe they did have a group experience. It does happen. There are sightings of Mary recorded all over the place, where hundreds of people claim to have seen Mary at the same time. So even if you say that they're all together, that they had them together, it doesn't rule out the possibility of hallucinations.
I agree.
But I don't think from the minimal facts that we can say that there were group appearances to the disciples. We don't know that. We don't. The only reason we think that is because of other gospel stories.
I know, but so I apologize for nitpicking, but I want to be, like, if we're going to be clear about this, we got to be very clear. I do not believe that scholars believe that the majority of these resurrection appearances occurred because of the minimal facts. They believe it because of historical evidence. That's the point. Not because of minimal facts, because of historical evidence. It's minimal facts because of historical evidence, not the other way around.
But they all believe those things, or they could believe those things for different reasons. You're assuming the reasons are the same as your reasons.
Nope, I'm not. So my reasons are completely different from what's in here. Okay, all right, I'm standing up here trying to make an argument. I'm trying to support the argument that's made in the book, the minimal facts approach, Gary Habermas's argument. Right. I'm up here playing Gary Habermas's apologist. Right. And I'm saying what Habermas and Lycona are saying is these minimal facts are agreed upon by the majority of Christian scholars, and the majority of Christian scholars believe that because of the evidences. And the evidences include such things as oral tradition, most of it captured in Paul and Acts and the Gospels. They believe in an aggregation of eyewitness accounts, typically, for a lot of these scholars, that the eyewitnesses are piece and part of that. Many of them will say Q is kind of the initial aggregation of that kind of stuff. Most of it found it in Mark, etc. John is separate material. They have their own debates about John and who the potential author of John was, etc. Whether it was John or not, I agree with all that. But I'm saying we don't ignore that as historical evidence.
To me, I mean, to be convincing to me, if you want to go outside the 5 facts that everyone agrees on, you have to demonstrate.
I'm not going outside the facts. What we're talking about. No, again, I apologize if I'm not communicating this well, but there are 5 facts, right? We'll just say 5 facts. Well, 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. None of them are evidence. 0. None of them are historical evidence. They're not. They're claims about historical
You're trying to
accounts.
use them as evidence to...
No, I'm not. Absolutely. Like, you got to understand, I'm not trying to use them as evidence for any of the facts. What we're trying to say is, given the evidence, which established, so here's some body of evidence, right? Here's evidence. And this is this big clump of historical evidence. And what they're doing is saying, I'm looking at this evidence, and there's evidence that this is true, and there's evidence that this is true. And in fact, what Habermas is saying is, the majority of scholars agree that the evidence supports the claim that these 5 facts are more plausibly true than not. Right. Then what he's saying is, there are a number of possible explanations for these facts, right? So there could be, this was hallucinations. There could be, this was all fabricated from the get-go. So there's all these potential explanations. And we'll call it E1, E2, E3, etc. And what claiming is E1, which is that Christianity is true, basically. That E1 is the most reasonable explanation of those. So this is the flow of information and data and the framework in which they have founded this. So to say something like you're claiming this fact is the case and you're having to go outside the fact in order to provide evidence for it is not, like, that's the whole point. That's how any historical claim works.
let me use this example. Say we have a criminal trial.
Okay.
And somebody's being prosecuted.
Yes.
The jury comes back and they say he's guilty.
Yes.
All of those jurors came to that conclusion.
Yes.
That doesn't mean that they all agreed on what evidence led them to that conclusion.
All right.
One juror could have been convinced by witness number one. The other juror might have thought witness number one was stupid, but witness number two sealed the deal.
Yep.
One of them was convinced by the fingerprint evidence.
Yep.
Right? So because they agree on the outcomes, various outcomes, doesn't mean that they agree on what led them to that.
Well, what do you mean by
And so-
outcomes? I want to stick to the same terminology that we're talking about here.
You're saying 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 are all outcomes of the
Nope, they're
evidence.
facts. They're facts. They're truth claims.
Based on evidence. Right?
Are you talking about
so they'd be
E1? Are you
similar-
talking about these right here, or are you talking about these?
I'm talking about the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
Yeah. Okay. These are.
You're saying
facts.
those are conclusions based on this other evidence.
Yeah.
Right? So they would be like the verdict based on
Nope.
evidence.
Nope. The verdict's over here. Verdict's over
You're
here.
saying that evidence leads to the conclusions. 1, 2,
Nope.
3, 4,
Nope.
5.
The evidence leads to facts, and facts are the ones that you draw into for conclusions.
Facts. You're concluding the facts based on the evidence.
You draw the facts from the evidence. So
Well, just like in a jury trial, they come to what they call a fact that this person is guilty.
Yep.
Based on the evidence.
No, that's not considered a fact in that area. That's considered like whether you pronounce somebody guilty or something. That's not a fact. I mean, you would say it's a fact that this person is guilty, but in the legal forum, you'd say, you have a determination of guilt. You have a sentencing that happens after it, but the guilt determination or not guilt determination is based on two things. The facts that were gathered and displayed in the facts in the evidence is usually how the
facts are evidence.
I agree, but facts are truth claims that are extracted from the evidence, right? So as an example, we'll go back to my Steve shot somebody kind of thing, and then over here for comment. We had a conclusion that we wanted to come to, like guilt or innocence. Did Steve shoot? I forgot who he shot, Al or somebody. Did Steve shoot Al? And so we found there was a bunch of evidence, or facts, you could say. And there was a gun laying here with a serial number. There was a video camera evidence. There was a couple eyewitnesses that saw Steve leave the scene, that kind of thing. So each one of those, individually, we would call facts, right? Or we could call them pieces of evidence.
Yes.
And we might turn around and say something like this. It's a fact that Steve was seen leaving the scene of the crime from which he left his own pistol, which was still hot, according to a witness. So that's a fact, that's a truth claim that was drawn directly from three pieces of evidence. Okay, so maybe you can call it a meta fact if you want to. And in this sense right here, these are the meta facts. These are the overall claim, the truth claim that these guys are making, but they're appealing. He is not self-referentially calling any of these facts.
Right, you're saying that it comes from evidence.
It comes from evidence, and that's my question to you.
What I'm saying is the evidence is different for different scholars to reach. You can reach fact number one.
I agree with that. I don't disagree with you, brother. But where is this?
So then you can't assume that any individual piece of evidence is something that's accepted by the majority of scholars.
Okay, fine. I'm fine assuming that.
So that's the only point I'm trying to make.
Okay, then I'm asking you a separate question.
Okay.
Where is the evidence that these guys are the majority of scholars? Where is the evidence coming from that allows them to say this?
Different places for
Tell me the different places.
Well, all of them are using evidences from the sources that we have.
What sources are we talking about?
Sources in the Bible, in the New Testament specifically.
Okay, then we're in agreement.
Right.
Okay.
But they don't all agree on every individual piece of it.
I never said they did. And the argument doesn't depend on them all agreeing. The argument depends on them all agreeing that these facts are more plausibly true than they're false. That's what the
So
argument
I'm willing
depends.
to accept those facts, except for I don't accept that all the appearances happened at the same time.
Okay,
Or that all the disciples necessarily believed.
that's fine.
But I'm not willing to accept automatically what you're considering evidence for those facts. So
I don't accept them automatically either. I don't know. You may not believe me on this one because you think that in virtue of my being a Christian, I'm credulous. I will tell you that I am the, as far as I know, I am the most skeptical person that a human being can be, consistent with not being so skeptical you can't believe it.
Yeah, I'm not trying to direct anything at you.
Okay, so I'm telling you that I don't, all the things that you're talking about are straw men. I don't argue that. I'm just saying that Habermas is claiming that these 5 facts right here are accepted by the majority of scholars. That's it. And that furthermore, that the evidence.
Okay. Yeah, I don't think we're getting anywhere.
Well, hold on. I gave the floor to her first, and then we'll go back and forth. And by the way, I don't. In solid ground, if we're not getting anywhere, there's 3 possibilities. Either you and I are both missing each other completely. You're missing it, or I'm missing it. And everybody here's responsibility is to point out which of us is missing it. Like that's the other thing that we need to do, including guests. Okay.
I think the main disagreement comes from you don't agree with the facts. Anyway, you're giving that up to talk about it, right? But the evidence on this side, you can't say the majority of scholars have this piece of evidence, they also accept it, and it leads to the first fact.
Right.
Because they don't. The majority don't.
In some cases they do.
Or it's different. It's so different you can't be like,
you
this
have to look
goes
at
to
it
one.
on an individual basis. Like, for example, Thomas, most scholars do not believe that happened, that Thomas poked Jesus in the side.
Okay, so let me grant that for a second, and to her point then, make this point right here. Let's consider only the row in the middle. Only the row in the middle. We're not thinking about either side.
Right.
Do you agree that the majority of scholars agree with those 5 facts as more plausibly true than false?
Yes.
Okay.
But I think they're wrong on one of those points.
Fair enough. All their argument is not, nowhere does Habermas say, okay, there's a very polite gentleman who's very long-suffering and willing to engage with Scott, who's will come to solid ground, and he doesn't think that this is the case. But this, right, he's making a point solely based on those guys.
Right.
And his argument is
that, but you're smuggling in these other evidences.
I'm not. So let me officially not do that right now and say forget all the other evidences. The only evidence I'm going to use is this.
Okay. Good.
The majority of scholars agree these 5 facts are more plausibly true than false.
Yes.
The best explanation of those 5 facts is that Jesus rose from the dead. Now that's it. Now we can disagree. We need to figure out how that process works that gives me that conclusion and whether that's the most rational way to do it. But this side, at this point, doesn't matter if what we're going to do is make an appeal to authority, which is a logical fallacy. But the authority that we're appealing to is most scholars.
I have more to say, but so do other people. So.
Yeah, we'll come back to you.
Yeah. I think you answered it. I was just trying to complete the metaphor of guilty being the far side and this is Steve's gun being the middle.
Yeah, right. Okay. Yes, sir.
I didn't fully read the book, admittedly, but I gave it a skim. And correct me if I'm wrong, but you're saying that you're frustrated with the evidence because the evidence seems self-referential because all of the proof that we have for the facts lies in the Gospels, which is what's under debate. But doesn't Gary Habermas in the book go over non-Gospel evidence, including Tacitus and other Roman historians?
Yeah, but all of those are much later. I think that most scholars wouldn't accept that evidence as pointing to any of these facts. Like, for example, when Bart Ehrman discusses these facts, he doesn't use any of that external evidence. And all Tacitus really tells us is that this is what Christians during the time of Tacitus believed happened, which was all afterwards. So it doesn't count as any independent evidence. It only is telling us what Christians of that time believed.
But it does tell you that the Christians of that time believed they
It's
saw.
an early belief. Yeah.
Christians at that time believed that Jesus was crucified.
Right. It would only be, but where it is evidence.
Proof that actually happened.
So it's evidence against a theory that might say this was legendary accretion that occurred in the Middle Ages.
It's evidence against this legendary accretion that happened after Tacitus.
That's what I mean.
Right.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Yeah, you absolutely have to say this historical evidence goes back to here, so it's proof against fabrication post that point. Not proof. It's evidence against fabrication post that point. Yeah,
that doesn't tell us that thing actually. It's not evidence for whether that event actually happened. They're telling us.
Not necessarily, because it is the case that if the evidence actually happened, you would expect to see.
Yeah, it's definitely not in contradiction with it.
So
it doesn't.
It is evidence for, but to your point, it's closer to it might be closer to this side of the spectrum than the proof side of the spectrum.
Yeah, it's like hearsay
Well, yeah, hearsay is allowed, by the way, in court in some cases.
in civil courts.
Yes, and it's allowed even in criminal court in very limited
Yeah,
places.
someone died or something like that, you can testify to that.
There's a couple other ones that I happen to have direct experience with now, but to your point, it's generally rejected. Yes.
So I'm sorry, what's your name?
I'm Will.
Will, sorry. I'm Jim.
That's in Jim.
Nice to meet you. So I think the point you're trying to make is, like, fact one, that the disciples believed that they saw Jesus risen from the dead, is questionable because it's like your theory of Peter saw it and then he told the other disciples, and so then they believed it.
Right.
But they didn't, you're saying they didn't actually see him. They are believing Peter's message.
It's possible, we don't know why they did it.
And so you're therefore saying you can't pull any of the other evidence that's on the right-hand side here to counter your argument because there's no agreement among scholars that drove them to the first point. And I think Scott's saying is we have to go back then and figure out what do we agree on the evidence side to figure out
Right, that's what I'm saying.
your conclusion. Whatever conclusion you want to get to about why do most scholars agree that they believe in saw Jesus risen from the dead?
Yeah, that's right.
Only one of them that we saw, or a couple of them, not all of them.
Right.
I just want to make sure that's what we're all.
That's right.
Okay.
Yes.
So now it's really all coming down to the evidence side,
Right,
which is what you're arguing. And I think Scott, you were saying no, I can do it with just the 5 facts.
I'm saying Habermas does it with just the 5 facts.
Okay.
So what I was trying to answer the question was, I thought, and maybe I misunderstood it, that what Will was saying was, this is evidence. You're bringing in other evidence.
Right.
This is only based on these. My point is, none of these are evidence. These are all conclusions drawn from the evidence.
Understood.
And these conclusions right here are the premises of an argument that results in a conclusion that Jesus rose from the dead.
But taking that conclusion and then trying to add another fact to it to get to your final conclusion or
Yeah, that we shouldn't be doing. But the facts that I was bringing up, the evidence, the additional facts I was bringing up, were intended to be evidence for one of each of these facts.
that's where the crux of it is that he doesn't agree with those evidences, so you're pulling in to get to that.
Or Will, are you saying that the evidence on the right-hand side is driving the acceptance of which hypothesis is most likely to prove all the facts?
Right, I'm saying.
And I think he's saying this, that it is that line between driving which explanation.
Yeah, if at any point in here I'm putting in a 6th fact, I shouldn't be doing that for Habermas's argument. I mean, I could do that and develop another argument, but
What's happening is you're getting to agree to the 5 facts, generally, but then saying that automatically means I have to accept the evidences, and that's not correct. Because the evidences, people believe 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 based on different interpretations of the evidence. Some accept some evidence, some don't accept that, some of the evidence. So some scholars might accept 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 because it says in John that Thomas touched Jesus, and later traditions say that all of the disciples were martyred for this. That may be why a conservative believes in 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. But other scholars might have completely different reasons for believing those things. So it's not legitimate to say, okay, you've accepted 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, therefore you have to accept all of the evidence that we think is the reason for accepting 1, 2, 3, 4.
yeah, I agree with that. But I unless I'm much mistaken, I have not said that, nor do I intend to say.
For example, with the swoon theory, the idea that Jesus wasn't quite dead.
Yeah.
One of the evidences given for why that theory fails is because Jesus was speared in the side and the water came out.
Yeah.
I think that only appears in John. And so that is very weak evidence that most scholars don't accept John's story of what happened, especially in that level of detail. So it can't count as a refutation of that alternative theory. So it is happening very frequently that evidences outside of these 5 are being used either to bolster your own argument or weaken alternative hypotheses.
Yes. So I think that's, if I understand what you're saying right. So here's evidence, and we'll take just one sample piece of evidence and we'll break it out here. and we'll say that evidence comes in a group, and we'll call this group we'll say spear. Was he speared in the side? Okay, and they'll, here's a third of the people that are like, yes, okay, I believe these sources, it definitely happened. Here's some people that say the historical data are ambivalent on this one. And here's a group that was like, no, absolutely not. There's no good evidence for that, and here's why. Okay, fair enough. The fact that Jesus, or the truth claim that Jesus was speared or not, is not the only evidence that he would have against the swimming theory.
Right, but it is evidence that's used in the book and that you used in your presentation. So my point is that there are evidences being brought into the case that are outside of the 5 agreed upon points. And if you want to use those evidences,
so this is again like now I'm being difficult. I acknowledge it, but that's what you're saying is not a good objection. And the reason it's not a good objection is all of the evidence is outside of that fact. All of it. All of the evidence that Jesus died by crucifixion is outside of the fact that Jesus died by crucifixion. All of it. So it's not a reasonable objection to say, oh, you're citing John here, not everybody accepts it. All of the evidence is outside of the fact. The fact is a conclusion drawn from the evidence.
So can you, if you're saying the majority of scholars accept these 5 truth claims, can you only use evidence that the majority of scholars also agree on?
Well, we haven't established those.
Is that not even the point?
That's the best, most succinct question that's been asked this whole time. So
like if you don't want to use the doubting Thomas touching thing or the swooning thing, throw that out. And are there other pieces of evidence?
Right, we'd have to look at each individual.
Is that not even where you're going with this stuff?
That's exactly right. Yes, there are some of these facts. So in the spear thing, these right here, we'll change it. These are facts that all of these scholars agree on. All these majority of scholars agree on. Here, these are a group of facts that half of them agree on and half of them disagree on. And here are the other half of the facts that these guys up here affirm that these guys contest. Right. So if what she's saying is, do you believe that in order for it to be the case that you are going to talk about evidence in support of these 5 facts, that you can only use that evidence that the majority of scholars depend upon to make their determination?
No, in fact, I think a lot of times what the minority believes is accurate.
Okay, then why are you objecting to us bringing in those facts?
Because they're not established. So because most scholars don't think that he was speared, to me that doesn't mean that it didn't happen, but you have to demonstrate that it happened. Okay. And in this case, it didn't. It was just put out there, oh, well, the swim theory can't be right for A, B, and C, and one of those evidences is the spearing.
Yeah, but it sounds like what she's saying is right, that you're saying that only stuff that you should be talking about is stuff that the majority of scholars think is the case.
I'm saying that's the case you're trying to make with the 5.
Forget what I'm trying to make.
With the argument that is, as it is built, is that there are these 5 minimal facts that most scholars agree on, and that's why we can come to these conclusions.
Yes.
Right?
That's right.
And then you're trying to bring in other facts outside of those agreed upon things.
I'm just trying to explain why they believe those 5 facts.
Right, but I don't think that's
or good evidence.
I don't think it's good reasons. I don't think it's necessarily why most scholars believe in those facts.
I'll ask a separate question. Okay, but if that's the case,
my main point is.
But wait, if what the reasoning that you just gave us was, I don't believe that that's why those scholars believe in those 5 facts.
Right, that hasn't been demonstrated.
What that suggests is that the reason that what you think that we ought to be talking about are the evidences that those scholars use. Yes, that's what she's saying.
Right, we need to examine the individual evidences.
Okay, do you have a list of those evidences, so to speak, of which ones you think the majority of scholars depend upon, right? You're making a claim to knowledge here. The claim that you're making to knowledge is, I know what those majority of scholars are depending upon, within reason, of why they believe that. And you're talking about ones they don't depend upon, but here are the ones that they do depend upon. The question I tried to direct to you earlier on in class.
I know that there are controversies over some of these issues.
Okay, so the question is, do you believe that the majority of scholars are well founded in their belief in non-controversial sources and evidence that do yield those 5 facts. Another way of asking it is, do you think those are 5 historical facts?
Well, it's varying levels. Like the empty tomb, for example, I don't think
You're more skeptical of that.
right. I think it's 50-50. I think it's less likely that that happened.
Okay.
So yeah, you have to take each individual one.
Yeah, roger that. Okay.
I just wanted to clarify. Forgive me, I haven't actually read the book. Is one of the minimal facts that Jesus died?
By crucifixion, specifically. Yeah.
So I'm guessing the flow in the book is, like, if everyone agrees Jesus died by crucifixion, that automatically discounts the swoon theory, right? Because died and swoon don't go together.
Yes, that's right.
So the flow of evidence is not Jesus died by crucifixion, therefore spear. It's spear supports crucifixion.
Yeah, you may have said everybody in this.
Sorry,
in this case, it's that these putative majority of scholars do not believe this one.
Yeah, I'm saying, like, if I understand correctly, we're discussing evidence for the claims. Which
Yes.
some might say spear, some might say something else.
Right.
But we should still be discussing.
Yeah, whether he was speared or not is not the fact under contention. The fact under contention was, did he die by crucifixion?
Yeah.
Yes, that's
Right, but I think she's saying that if we accept fact number 1,
Yep.
then that rules out the swoon theory.
That's right. That's right.
But fact number 1 is, we agreed, about 95% likely to be true.
Well, I mean, I made that up out of thin air, right? So I don't know that.
Sure.
Like, I don't even
No,
agree with
it's
that.
not-
I'm
it's
the
not
guy who
certain.
came up with it. Yeah.
It's not certain.
Right.
So even if most scholars believe that that's true, it could still be wrong.
Sure.
Right? So I think all of the alternative hypotheses are very unlikely to have happened.
Okay.
But whatever happened was very unlikely to happen. Like, this was a singular event in history, right? So no
Sure.
matter what happened, it's going to be
Something unlikely.
right? So,
I'd say that's a good way of looking at it. Yeah.
So I don't think an unlikely explanation should be ruled out because it's unlikely. Because no matter what we come up with, it's going to have been unlikely.
I'll agree with that, but let's not take that too far and say, well, since it's unlikely, we'll just assume that everything is equally unlikely, and we're going to stop using evidence and reason.
Right? Yeah, of course.
Okay, good to go. Yes, sir.
I had a question kind of on that, like the probability and the combination theory and all of that.
Yes.
Because I guess with the Bayesian approach of things, look at the evidence, probability of the evidence, given that the claim is true versus not true. Right?
Yes.
And that's used, I guess, to support the resurrection. But couldn't that also be used for the combination theory?
Yeah, so I will admit that this is the part that I want to talk about most, and I also recognize it's the part that most people don't want to talk about most, so I'll be as contained as I can about it. I do want to say in all fairness, you can ask my wife's a professor of statistics and psychology, right? So that doesn't mean that I know what I'm talking about, obviously. But these are the kinds of things that we sit around and discuss. And we have sat around and discussed this one too. When we try to say, here are a number of legal facts, as an example. So I'll talk about the 2 things that we talked about. There are a number of legal facts. And in this case, we said, like, we had the gun ownership, we had the bullet kind of forensic data. This was the bullet that came from the gun that killed the guy. This was camera, and we had witness 1 and witness 2. One of the things that I wanted to point out is it is not a legitimate use of statistics to say we're 95% sure that the gun was his gun. We're 95% sure that the bullet is his bullet. We're 95% sure that the camera is recording data that actually happened. That is to say, somebody didn't get in deep fake it, or it wasn't, somehow altered or whatever else. This witness we consider 95% reliable, and reliable, by the way, encompasses everything, like not on drugs, not hallucinating, not lying. And usually for us, most of the time when we're thinking about whether a witness is reliable, it's usually mostly down to, are they lying or not? And sometimes did they see something? But that it is not the case that the right way to combine these evidences is to multiply these probabilities. That's not how probability works, because these are independent events, but they're not independent events in the same category. They are considered different categories of evidence. That the purpose of which, that is to say, if you only had the gun, the probability would be 95%. But if you have the gun and the bullet and the camera and the witness 1 and witness 2, that now you're down to less than 80%. That's not how our conference works.
That's not the argument I ever tried to make either.
Fair enough.
So the argument I was making was that as you add more, so if you have just the gun,
Yeah.
right, you're 95% sure that that's correct. But then if you add another fact that's only 95% likely to be correct,
Yep.
then the chance that one of those things is not correct has increased because you've increased the number of facts.
Okay.
So each time you add a fact,
Yep.
it increases the likelihood that one of the facts is incorrect, unless all of the facts are 100%. But if they're all 95%, it's more likely that one fact at 95% is true than that 5 facts are all true when they each have a 95% chance of being untrue. And the way that you figure out the probability that one of the facts is not correct is that you multiply them. And that gives you the probability that one of the 5 facts is not true. It doesn't give you anything to do with your final conclusion based on those facts. It just means that as you add facts that are uncertain, the probability increases that one of those facts will be false.
Okay, so make sure I understand it. And this is very different. I'm saying this is very different, so I'm not saying it's the same thing. If we were going to flip a coin, we could flip a coin 5 times in a row. We flip it first 4 times it came up heads each time. What's the probability? Does the fact that it came up improbably at this point, does that affect the probability that the last one is going to come up? Okay, because they're truly independent, right?
But if you're looking at it from the beginning, it's 50% chance anytime you flip a coin.
Yep.
But if you want to say, I'm going to get 5 heads, that's not 50% chance.
That's right.
That's a much lower probability that they all come up heads.
Right.
Because each time.
But just so that I'm 100% clear on what you're saying, here's the gun fact, 95%. So the 95% confidence that this was his gun means that we're 5% confident that it wasn't his gun. Right. Okay. 95% on the bullet, being it came from that gun. Okay. So technically those depend on each other. But we'll say we use the camera. The camera is separate. So 95% it was his gun. 95% camera saw him. We now accept these 2 facts. What do you think that the resultant the probability now that one of those facts is false has increased?
Yes, if you have multiple facts that don't prove each other.
Yep.
Like obviously, if one fact proves the other one, then they're related, right? But if it's unrelated facts, and they each have a certain level of probability, then the probability that one of those facts, we don't know which one, is not correct, increases with the number, like uncertainty compounds.
Yes.
If I say Tom works at McDonald's, that's more certain than if I say Tom works at McDonald's and Tom has a blue shirt. Yes. Because I'm asserting more facts, and there's always a possibility that one of those facts is incorrect.
So let me make a counter argument to this, and you tell me your evaluation and counter argument. Here's our witness. We'll pick witness 2 here, and I'm going to change witness 2 to 7. In fact, we're going to change witness 2 to 25%. Okay, why? Witness 2 is like a known fabricator, right? And sometimes they tell the truth, but like most of the time, they just like messing with people. And they start to give you, they lie. That they lie 3 times out of 4. Now, witness 2 claimed that they saw Steve come out of this place. Witness 1 claimed the same thing. The camera shows Steve came out of this place. The bullet was from Steve's gun, and the gun was Steve's. What do those 4, 1, 2, 3, and 4, do those increase or decrease the probability that the witness is telling the truth? Witness 2 is telling the truth.
Increases the probability because now they're all related facts.
And that's that didn't change the relationship of the facts. They were as related or not related as they were beforehand. And what we did was we didn't compound. What we did was those facts reinforced themselves to the point that now we went against the initial probability, and what we said, given the fact that multiple other independent lines of evidence suggested that Steve did in fact shoot Hal, that this guy's testimony right here is more it's more probable that he's in the 25% of the time that he tells the truth versus the 75% of the time that he's lying. See how it increased the probability that he's telling the truth?
Well, yes, because you're using the other ones as evidence for that one.
Yeah, they reinforce each other, which is the point of multiple lines of evidence. That's the only point I want to make. That's all. Okay. If we accept that, then we're cool.
Yeah.
I mean, we're cool anyway. If we accept that, then we agree on these.
Yeah, by definition, anytime you add another piece of evidence, you're increasing the probability that at least one of those pieces of evidence is going to be wrong in by itself, but then you're simultaneously increasing the probability that the whole is accurate.
Is more accurate. Each line of evidence makes it more probable that it's accurate, that the whole thing is true.
Maybe, but if you have to eliminate one of the evidences, then it might not. So, for example, if we had to eliminate W2,
yep,
it probably wouldn't have a huge impact on the overall outcome. Just like if you have to eliminate there was an empty tomb, I don't think it really affects the ultimate outcome, right? Jesus could have still been risen without the tomb. So it's not like I'm trying to say because one of these might be untrue that undermines the entire argument.
Fair enough.
I'm
Good to
not
go.
trying to say that.
Right. Then I think that then I shouldn't have wasted our time on the point. But it did have to do with probability theory, and I like talking about that.
So just to go back to where I think you're headed in terms of your argument against the resurrection, the claim that disciples martyr themselves for what they believe is not something you want to bring into the argument to get to the final conclusion, because you don't trust the martyrdom or the stories of what happened to them after.
Yeah, I think most of the stories of that are very late tradition. They're not. Most of them are in the Gospels. I think the Gospels only mention Peter, and so if you're willing to accept that, and probably Paul. They mentioned Stephen, but he wasn't one of the disciples. But none of the others. There's no evidence in the Gospels for their martyrdoms. They're all later traditions. Some of them might be true, some of them might not be. But I don't think you could say all of the disciples were martyred.
So going forward, you would prefer we not bring that as part of the evidence additions to the minimal facts to make the conclusion.
Right.
Unless that's the reason that most scholars believe that particular fact.
Right.
Well, and like I said, even
The
because
first fact of
I would reserve the right to myself to challenge even facts that most scholars believe in, if there are good scholarly reasons in the minority for disagreeing with it. So
you're saying that it's not fair to, you can say, okay, yeah, the evidence, majority agree with this, I agree with the majority believe with these minimal facts, and I disagree with how we got there. Then once you draw the conclusions on which alternative hypothesis is true, you cannot bring this over here to draw those conclusions.
You can, but you have to independently say why that's valid.
Yeah.
Right? I don't think we can say all of the evidences are accepted because these top conclusions are accepted.
Right.
Yes, that's what I'm trying to say.
Well, first of all, thank you.
Yeah.
It's really good because it challenges me. I started out much like Scott, very skeptic as 18, raised in the church. And I was like, okay, I get that Jesus is a good guy. I do believe that he was a historical figure, but I don't know about the Son of God stuff. I don't know about any of this. And I went in secret to our interim pastor at the time, and I said, because my parents were leaders in the church. And I said, I don't believe this. I don't, and I'm going off to college. And he's like, gives me this look, now why do you believe what you believe? And I started answering. So I come very at things as a skeptic about. So I appreciate, first of all, the willingness to not only come and share, but to persevere. And my encouragement, I haven't been in this class for very long at all, but I thank you, and I just, please, just continue to persevere, because I want to hear what you have to say.
Thank you very much. I mean, it's not difficult to persevere because it's been really welcoming. So I appreciate you all being willing to listen to me. I mean, so far outside of the group, and everybody's been really hospitable, and Scott's let me take up a lot of time, and I hope it's not been frustrating for people.
There's good frustration and there's bad frustration, right? You go to a soccer practice and you're frustrated that you can't dribble like you want, but you keep pushing through it and you do it. So if it's frustrating, it's good frustrating. So thank you. Okay, there was another probability point. Now completely brain locked in. Yes, sir.
I had a question actually for you all. And I'm just curious, you said something earlier, we were talking about the evidences And we were talking about majorities and minorities, and you made a statement, and I'm not sure if I heard it correctly. Maybe you can correct me. But in some instances, the majority of scholars may say one thing, and then you said that maybe they're right, but sometimes we thought that the minority of scholars might hold the accurate position. So you can't just use a majority of scholars or a minority of scholars. And I agree with that wholeheartedly, believe me. But I'm curious then, it almost seems like if that's, if you're not just going to go with what the majority of scholars say, because Gary Habermas's whole argument is like, well, what do a majority of scholars agree with? And if you're going to sit here and say that, I don't necessarily agree with what a majority of scholars agree with, that ultimately this argument, Gary Habermas's minimal facts argument, probably isn't even going to hold. Even if we were to, and you disagree that a majority of scholars agree with the specific pieces of evidence that he's using, and let's say that we did a survey. Let's say that we did that survey and we looked at everything and we saw that, oh yes, actually, like 70% agree on this one and 60% agree on this one and 90% agree on this one. And it turns out that maybe Gary Habermas was true, that still wouldn't hold a lot of fight for you. True in the sense that a majority of scholars, that's all I'm saying, a majority of scholars believe that these evidences are correct and that was the best explanation. Even if we were to do that survey and prove all those points, that wouldn't necessarily hold a lot of fight for you because the majority of scholars could be wrong.
Right. Yeah. I think that this is not a good way to demonstrate the historicity of the resurrection. I don't think there is a good way to demonstrate that. The reason I don't think this is a good way is because you can't be certain. One of the days we wrote like 95% for fact one. None of the scholars would say that any of these facts are 100% true. I mean, the right-wing ones would,
No,
conservative scholars would. So there's always a possibility of doubt, right? And so as long as the other plausible explanations are not 0%, then they're more likely to happen. Or as long as it's more than 5%, or whatever the total comes out to be, then that's more likely. Especially when you're talking about a supernatural event, we automatically assume those to be the least likely, and we don't accept supernatural events as explanations. So one of the things we've talked about is fairness.
So we've only got one. So we'll pick this up next time. We only got 1 minute left. But this is what I want to give you guys something to research this week, and I thought this was a good one. So this was the point that I hope would come up, and of course it came up 60 seconds from the end. Standard solid ground form there. I would like to take exception to what you're saying right now, and the evidence that I'll give you, and then we can start talking about next time, and then we can immediately divert off that. It's not what you want is. In the late 18th century, the hypothesis that meteorites were rocks that came from space was considered religious nonsense and only for fools, because it was claimed only in religious contexts. No core scientists believed it. And when the first physicists proposed, no, these are rocks that are coming from the solar system somewhere, and they're coming through the sky and they're landing on the earth, they were considered pariahs, and because this was obviously non-scientific garbage. Now, of course, we're like, what are you talking about? Like, that's as scientific a thing as we've got. Back then, because they were represented mostly by people who came from a supernatural believing background. The people were like, these are rocks from God. Like the Muslims stuck it in the corner of the Qibla. This is obviously nonsense. This is not rocks from God. This is nothing any scientist would believe. And many scientists completely ignored good scientific evidence for the belief that there are rocks floating around in the solar system that come and hit the planet once in a while. If you adopt the standard that I think that I've heard you articulate over the last 4 times, which I possibly have wrong, then the problem is you would also be with the guys that are saying, like, rocks are obviously not from, like, I'm not going to believe practically any evidence that comes from there. It's certainly not historical.
No,
that any of these rocks
came from God, that God set these rocks.
Well, that wasn't the rejection. The rejection was that these rocks came from the solar system, period.
Right, so that was wrong. They should have done
I agree,
it.
but I want to compare next time the standard of what you believe is acceptable. So if it's the case that you're automatically getting rid of God, then that's what we should start talking about.
Same thing with the meteors. God is not a good explanation for that.
Well, it's not a good explanation that God's sitting up there like a pitcher throwing them. I agree, but that wasn't what was under debate. So if we can start next time, basically, it's the question of what you just said. I think in response to Michael's question was very telling. There is no possible historical evidence in your mind. It sounds like it's good enough to establish that something like that a supernatural event occurred.
Right, supernatural event.
Okay,
I'm not saying that it could still be possible that he was resurrected. Maybe there's some kind of natural explanation for that. I wouldn't necessarily rule that out, but I would rule out a supernatural miracle.
So
Just like we do with Herodotus. There's all kinds of. You keep saying you want to be fair.
Understood. We'll pick it up at that point because we are out of time. But this, to everybody, like to me, this is a very important point. In fact, of all that we're talking about here, I would like to call it the most important point. And then subsequently, we need to get back. We will eventually, next class, get back to okay, how does this interact with historical evidence? But if the idea is there are going to be, so some thinkers are like, this is adequate because I believe I put my trust in historical evidence at this particular level. There are other thinkers that are like, nothing in history is ever going to be convincing of a miracle, so don't bother making an argument at all. Because no matter, even if you had an airtight argument with the best possible historical evidence that can ever be contrived, it's still not plausible. That needs to be recognized as well. And then, so I will not ambush you by telling you ahead of time that what I'm going to do is go back to your belief systems and say, and Hume's and company, and say, do you actually live like you believe what you're saying in here? That's going to be part of my counterattack, if you will. Thank you all very much for your time. And again, another round of applause for Will for standing up and being the manager. God be with you this week, and hopefully we'll see you next week.